"You're marrying a security guard?" My mom scoffed. 68 invites. My whole family. Boycotted my wedding. I walked down the aisle completely alone. Then my phone blew up after a guest posted a 10-second clip and captioned it, "Her groom is..." The voicemail was 11 seconds long. I know because I played it 14 times, and I counted. It was 11:43 p.m., the night before my wedding, and I was sitting cross-legged on the living room floor in the apartment Elliot and I shared, wearing an oversized gray t-shirt that had a small bleach stain near the hem, eating crackers straight from the box because I was too anxious to commit to an actual meal. My veil hung over the back of a dining chair like a ghost. My heels waited by the front door, obedient and patient in a way I had never been in my entire life. The marriage license sat on the coffee table, and I had already checked it 3 times that hour as though it might dissolve before morning. My phone buzzed at 11:42. My mother's name lit up the screen. I let it go to voicemail. 11 seconds later, I pressed play. "Claire, it is not too late to cancel. Do not embarrass this family like this." Click. No greeting, no softness, no trace of the woman who had once driven 45 minutes in a snowstorm to bring me cough syrup in college. Just that same clean, precise disapproval she had wielded my entire life. Like honesty and cruelty were the same instrument, and she had simply learned to play both. I sat there on the floor and played it again, then again, then again, until the words stopped meaning anything and became just sound, just the shape of a sentence arranged to make me small. I had been listening to that sentence in one form or another for 8 months, since the night I told my parents about Elliot, since my mother had set down her wine glass very carefully, the way she did when she was calibrating a response, and said, with a smile that didn't reach anywhere near her eyes, "You're marrying a security guard?" She said it the way people say you're eating that. She said it the way people say, "Really?" when they mean no. I said yes. I said he was kind and steady and funny, and that he made me feel like a person rather than a performance, and none of those words landed anywhere useful. My father had been quieter about it, which was somehow worse. He nodded and said he trusted my judgment, and then 2 weeks later he mailed me a letter. 4 pages, handwritten, which was the part that really twisted the knife, because my father only handwrote things he considered important. It described my relationship as a well-intentioned mistake, rooted in an understandable but temporary response to professional instability. He had included a paragraph about long-term financial compatibility. He signed it, "With deep concern and love." I had read it once, put it in a drawer, and never opened the drawer again. Over the following months, my brother Jason went quiet, the way younger siblings do when they don't want to pick a side but are absolutely picking a side. My aunts texted me ellipses instead of words. My mother called every few days to ask if I had reconsidered, which was her way of asking if I had come to my senses, which was her way of saying she had not come to hers. 68 invitations went out from my side alone. I addressed every envelope myself. I bought good stamps, the kind with flowers on them, because I had wanted this to feel like something worth celebrating. I had a guest list that included my parents, my brother, 4 aunts, 3 uncles, 11 cousins, 6 family friends who had watched me grow up at birthday parties and holiday dinners, 2 former colleagues, and a handful of people I had genuinely loved for years and foolishly believed loved me back. Not one RSVP came back, yes. Not one. I called the caterer from my car outside a pharmacy on a Tuesday afternoon, sitting in the parking lot with the engine running because I didn't trust myself to drive. I canceled 68 meals with a voice so broken, the woman on the other end asked twice if I was alright. I said I was fine. People say that when they are the furthest thing from it. I told Elliot that night over dinner, in the same flat tone I used when delivering bad news to anyone. The practiced calm I had developed over years of being the kind of person who cried alone in cars and composed herself before walking through doors. He had put his fork down. "We can go to City Hall," he said. "Just us. No audience." I wanted that more than I had wanted almost anything. Part of me wanted it desperately. The version of this that was quiet and private and required no witnesses to my humiliation. But something else in me wouldn't let it go. "No," I said. "I want the wedding." He waited, giving me space to finish the thought the way he always did, without filling the silence with his own discomfort. "I want them to know what they chose," I said. "I want the chairs to be empty while I'm standing there. I want it to be real." He nodded once. "Then we do it your way." I told the coordinator, a warm and carefully professional woman named Melissa Strand, not to rearrange the seating. 34 chairs on the left side of the aisle would stay exactly where they were, with their white ribbons and their small sprigs of eucalyptus, because I had paid for them, and because the absence deserved to take up space. The morning of the wedding, I got dressed alone. The bridal suite at the Hartwell Conservatory smelled like gardenias and warm hair tools, and something faintly chemical from the fresh flowers that had arrived at 6 that morning. The room had a long mirror framed in brass, and I stood in front of it while Melissa zipped my dress with the careful focus of someone diffusing something delicate. "You look beautiful," she said, and her voice had just enough gentleness in it to make my chest ache. I nodded because speaking would have broken something I needed to keep intact for the next 4 hours. I ate half a granola bar. I drank a full glass of water because I had read somewhere that dehydration makes you cry more easily, and I was not going to cry in front of 34 empty chairs if I could help it. At 3:58 p.m., I stood outside the ceremony doors. At 4:02 p.m., they opened. The string quartet was playing Pachelbel's Canon, which is perhaps the most commonly chosen wedding processional of all time, and which I had always found slightly too slow, like walking through water. I had kept it anyway because Elliot had said once, absently, that he liked it, and I had filed that away the way I had learned to file away everything he said that revealed something real about him. I stepped forward and saw it immediately. The left side of the aisle was completely empty. 34 white chairs decorated with white ribbons and small sprigs of eucalyptus sat untouched, catching the afternoon light through the conservatory glass, casting thin shadows across the stone floor. They looked ceremonial, deliberate, like a monument to something. The right side was full. Elliot's family filled every seat, his mother already crying openly, pressing a folded tissue to her face with both hands, his father sitting perfectly upright, jaw tight with the particular emotion men perform as composure, cousins and aunts and 2 of his college friends who had driven 6 hours and not once complained about it. His best man, a quiet cardiologist named David Park who had known Elliot since medical school, stood at the front with his hands clasped, watching the door. And at the end of the aisle, Elliot stood waiting. He was wearing a charcoal suit he had bought for the occasion, and a tie the color of deep water that I had picked out because it matched nothing in his wardrobe and somehow matched everything about him. His hands were at his sides, completely still, and when he saw me come through the door, something crossed his face. Not just love, which I had seen before, but something older and more complicated, something that had lived in him for longer than he had ever said out loud. I started walking. Each step echoed louder than it should have against the stone floor. The empty chairs sat in my peripheral vision like a held breath. I did not look at them directly. I looked at him, and I kept moving, because the alternative was stopping, and I was not going to stop. At the altar, he took both of my hands in his. His grip was steady and warm and said everything neither of us was ready to say out loud in front of witnesses. His vows were simple. He had told me he was writing them himself, and I had expected something polished, something that sounded like a speech. What he gave me instead was something that sounded like a confession. "I can't promise you easy days," he said quietly, in the voice he used when he was being completely honest, lower than his regular voice, slower. "I can't promise perfect timing or a life without hard nights, but I can promise you that everything I have is yours. I see you, Clay. I've always seen not who people expect you to be, you." When it was my turn, I forgot everything I had written. I had 3 index cards in my bouquet. I had rehearsed in the shower. I had practiced in front of the bathroom mirror twice and in front of Lauren, my former roommate, who was sitting in the front row of Elliot's side, 3 times. None of it came. What came instead was the truth, which is usually what happens when you're standing in front of someone you love and you stop performing. "You are enough," I said. "You have always been enough, and I choose you. Not a version of you. Not the idea of you. You. Every day." He kissed me, and everyone on his side stood and applauded, and for one single pure moment the room felt full. The reception was held in the conservatory's adjoining hall, and it was beautiful in the way that events become beautiful when someone has worked very hard to make them so. There were flowers on every table, low and lush and smelling faintly of something expensive. There were candles and small brass votives, and the kind of ambient lighting that makes everyone look like they are worth something. There was also an entire long table on the left side of the room, untouched and perfectly set, place cards arranged in careful handwritten script for 68 people who were not there. The caterer had offered to remove it. I had said no. I danced with Elliot's father, who held my hand like I was something he intended to protect, and did not say a word the entire song, and somehow that was the right thing. I ate exactly 4 bites of my dinner. I drank 2 glasses of champagne slowly and deliberately, because I wanted to be present for all of it, every beautiful and hollow minute of it. David Park gave a toast. It was warm and funny and referenced things I didn't know about Elliot, small stories from residency that I tucked away to ask about later. He raised his glass and said, "To Claire and Elliot, the 2 most quietly stubborn people I have ever met, which is exactly why this is going to work." Everyone laughed. I laughed. It was 7:23 p.m. when the music stopped. Not because the DJ paused it. The DJ had nothing to do with it. The music stopped because a man near the dessert table made a sound that cut through the ambient noise of the room the way only one kind of sound does. Sudden, sharp, and wrong. A chair scraped. A woman screamed. Not dramatically, just the involuntary output of witnessing something terrifying. Then there was a thud. The kind a human body makes when it has stopped cooperating with gravity. The man was somewhere in his early 60s, heavyset, with the gray complexion of someone who had been not quite right for longer than he had admitted to anyone. He had come as a +1 of one of Elliot's colleagues, and I did not know his name. Panic spread through the room the way it always does. In a ring, radiating outward from the center of the terrible thing, people pushing back, people pulling out phones, someone near the bar saying, oh God," in a quiet loop. Elliot moved before anyone else. He was at the man's side before I had fully registered what was happening. He dropped to his knees on the marble floor. Good suit, wedding night, did not hesitate for a single second, and his voice came out completely different. Not the voice he used at home, not the voice from the vows. Something stripped of everything except information. "Call 911 now. Male, early 60s, unresponsive, suspected cardiac arrest. Does anyone have an AED on the premises?" A woman in her 40s near the edge of the crowd took 2 steps forward. She moved with the same calibrated efficiency he did, and I would learn later that she was Dr. Nadia Reyes, a 30-year emergency medicine attending from Jefferson Memorial, there as a +1 as well. "I have one in my car," she said. 2 minutes. "Go," he said. Then, to a man standing 6 feet away who had not panicked, who was also moving toward the scene with that same terrifying calm, "Can you take compressions?" "Yes," the man said. 2 inches, consistent rate, switch every every 2 minutes. The man nodded and knelt down. What happened in the next 9 minutes I have replayed so many times that it has started to feel like something I watched rather than something I stood inside of. Nadia Reyes returned with the AED at a full run, heels off, barefoot on the marble. Elliot operated it without looking at the manual. He gave instructions in short, precise sentences that people followed without question, because that kind of authority is not performed, it is recognized. When the EMTs arrived, 2 men and a woman in their 30s who pushed through the conservatory doors with a stretcher and a bag, the lead paramedic looked at the scene and said, with the relief of someone who had arrived to find the job already being done correctly, "Dr. Hayes, we've got it from here. Dr. Hayes." I was standing 6 feet away, holding my wedding bouquet, still wearing my veil, and I heard it the way you hear something that has been true the whole time, but that you have been somehow not quite letting yourself hear. Dr. Hayes. The paramedics took over. The man was alive. I would learn that later, much later. His name was Richard Calloway, and he would spend 4 days in the ICU and go home to his wife and 2 adult daughters. And every year for the next several years, he would send Elliot a card on the anniversary of that night, which I would find in a small stack in Elliot's desk drawer much later, all of them unopened. But in the moment, I stood there in my wedding dress with the empty chairs still arranged on the other side of the hall, and the word doctor settled into my chest like something that had been waiting a very long time to land. If you want to understand why that word shattered something in me on my own wedding night, you have to go back 14 months to a hospital waiting room at 2:17 a.m. That smelled like fluorescent lighting and vending machine coffee, and the particular exhaustion of a Tuesday that had gone badly wrong. My roommate Lauren had been in a bike accident. A car had clipped her on the corner of 5th and Madison. Nothing life-threatening. A fractured wrist and bruised ribs, and the kind of shaken-up shock that takes longer to heal than the physical damage. They had told me twice she was fine. I could not stop sitting in the hard green chairs anyway, because hospitals do something to time that makes logic stop working and fear start filling the gap. I had been there long enough for my legs to go numb when a pair of worn black work boots stopped in front of me. "You've been here a while," a man said. "Have you eaten anything?" I looked up. Dark hair that needed cutting, eyes that were tired in a comfortable, long-term way rather than an acute way. He was wearing a security uniform, the standard issue navy blue of a hospital facility worker, an ID badge clipped to the breast pocket, and he had a stillness about him that I noticed because it was unusual in a place built entirely around urgency. Most people in hospitals move like they are late for something. He did not. "No," I said, "the vending machines are broken." He looked toward them with the expression of a man who had been personally inconvenienced by this before. "Stay here," he said, which was a strange thing to say to someone sitting alone in a waiting room, and I almost laughed, but I did not move. He came back 6 minutes later with a turkey sandwich in plastic wrap and a cup of coffee in a paper cup with a cardboard sleeve. "Borrowed from the staff room," he said, with the undecorated simplicity of someone who just does things rather than narrating them. The sandwich was cold in the middle. The coffee tasted like it had been sitting since the previous shift. Both were the best things I had experienced all night. "Thank you," I said. "You really didn't have to do that." He sat down in the chair 2 seats away and shrugged in a way that meant I know I wanted to. We talked for 20 minutes. It wasn't dramatic or charged. It was just a conversation between 2 people in a place that required them to be human with each other. He told me his name was Elliot Hayes, that he worked nights managing operations and safety for the hospital, that he preferred nights because that was when the real work happened. I told him about Lauren, about my job in publishing, about the book I was halfway through editing that I couldn't focus on because every time I looked at my phone I thought about how frail everything was. He listened the way very few people actually listen, without waiting for his turn to speak, without redirecting to himself, without performing interest. He just received what I said. At one point, a nurse walked past and started to say, "Dr. H," before catching herself mid-step and redirecting. "Sorry, Mr. Hayes, the family in Bay 4 is asking about discharge paperwork." He nodded. She moved on. I noticed it the way you notice something that doesn't quite fit without knowing what it is yet. I filed it somewhere in the back of my mind and left it there. 3 days later, he found me on LinkedIn. I still do not know how. I had not given him my last name, and we had not exchanged numbers. Lauren's theory was that he had checked the intake log against the visitor records and worked backward, which, when I eventually asked him, he did not deny and did not confirm. He simply sent me a message that said, "Hope your friend is doing okay. If she is, would you like to get coffee sometime?" Lauren was sitting in my doorway with her arm in a brace when I read it, and she said, without hesitation, and with the authority of someone who had just survived a near-death experience and felt entitled to opinions, "Say yes." So I said yes. Our first date was at a Saturday food market in a converted warehouse near the river, the kind of place that smelled like cardamom and frying things and old wood. He was already there when I arrived, standing with his hands in his jacket pockets, and he looked so completely unbothered by waiting that it made me feel, for the first time in recent memory, like arriving late was a normal thing rather than a failing. We ate, we walked, we talked for 3 hours, without either of us looking at a clock. His phone buzzed twice, and he answered both times in short, clipped technical shorthand that did not sound like anything a facilities manager would need to say. "What kind of security job is that?" I asked the second time. He looked at me with a small, careful smile. "The kind that keeps things running," he said. It was an answer. It was also not an answer. I recognized both things simultaneously and chose to accept the version that let me keep enjoying myself. That became the pattern. Over the next 8 months, we built something I had not had before. Not a relationship structured around grand gestures and performances, but something quieter and more load-bearing. He showed me parts of the city that felt lived in rather than curated. He made dinner on Thursdays. He read voraciously across subjects and left books in stacks around the apartment with small torn pieces of paper marking things he wanted to remember or share. He was not a man who talked about himself easily, but he was a man who listened, and he was a man who showed up. And at some point, I had stopped noticing the distinction. His phone rang at hours that did not make sense for a hospital operations manager. I told myself that hospitals ran around the clock. At his apartment, I found medical textbooks stacked beside the couch, thick, annotated, flagged with color-coded tabs. Harrison's Principles of Internal Medicine, Tintinelli's Emergency Medicine, books that cost several $100s and were used. You read these? I asked once, holding one up. I like understanding how things work, he said. That is not a real answer. It's the one you're getting, he said lightly, and kissed me, and I laughed and put the book down, and the question dissolved the way questions do when you are happy enough not to press. I should have pressed. I know that now. I knew it then, in the part of myself I was not listening to. The first time I brought him to my parents' house for dinner, he wore a gray button-down and brought a bottle of Burgundy he had clearly researched, and he stood in the hallway of the house I grew up in, a house of imported furniture and framed credentials, and the particular quiet of wealth that has been around long enough to stop performing, and he looked completely comfortable, which somehow made everything worse, because it gave my mother nothing concrete to object to beyond her instinct. She had dressed for the occasion in the way she did when she wanted someone to understand the architecture of the room they were walking into. My father asked Elliot about his work. Elliot said he worked in operations for Jefferson Medical Center, that he managed a large team and dealt with high-stakes situations under time pressure. My father nodded with the expression of a man whose grandson had told him about a very interesting rock. Then a neighbor mentioned that her son was dealing with chronic vertigo that had resisted 3 rounds of treatment. Elliot set his fork down. Has anyone ruled out vestibular neuritis? He said. If the dizziness started after a respiratory infection, that would be worth looking at before moving on to other diagnoses. The table went quiet in the particular way tables go quiet when something has happened that everyone will process separately, later, in private. My mother looked at him the way a scientist looks at data that contradicts their hypothesis. How would you know that? She said. I work in a hospital, Elliot said. That answer told her nothing and told me everything. The evening ended politely, which in my family's language meant coldly. My mother walked him to the door with the warmth of a woman who had been raised to be civil regardless of her feelings. My father shook his hand. 2 weeks later, the letter arrived. 4 pages. Deep concern, financial compatibility, well-intentioned mistake. That same week, on a Wednesday night, I woke at 2:14 a.m. to the sound of Elliot on the phone in the hallway, his voice low and precise. I lay still and listened. If the O2 sats drop below 88, intubate immediately. Don't wait for the attending. I'll be there in 12 minutes. I stared at the ceiling. Security managers did not say that. Operations staff did not say that. People who were not doctors did not say that. I did not ask him about it in the morning. I made coffee and handed him a cup, and we talked about something else entirely. And the question went back into the drawer, into the pile of things I had decided, consciously, deliberately, not to open. Because I was happy. Because what we had felt real. Because I had watched relationships built on perfect credentials and matching tax brackets corrode from the inside. And I had decided that whatever this was, it was not that. 3 months before the wedding, I picked him up from work. He came out of the staff entrance wearing scrubs, not a uniform, not navy blue facility worker clothing, green surgical scrubs with the Jefferson Memorial logo on the left chest, and he was still wearing a stethoscope around his neck that he pulled off and folded into his jacket pocket without looking at it. A nurse held the door behind him and called after him, Dr. Hayes, the family in Bay 3 wanted to say thank you before you left. He paused, turned, said something I couldn't hear through the car window. When he got in, I looked at him. She's new, he said, still getting the names straight. I looked back at the road. I did not say, stethoscopes are not standard issue for security personnel. I did not say, nurses do not typically thank facilities managers for clinical outcomes. I did not say any of the things that were obvious and true and sitting directly in front of me. I said, are you hungry? He said, starving. And we went to dinner, and it was a good night, and I chose, one more time, to let the question wait. Then came the invitations. Then came the silence. Then came the letter from my father, and Jason's absence, and my mother's 11-second voicemail. Then came the morning of the wedding, and the empty chairs, and Elliot's face at the end of the aisle. Then came the word doctor, spoken by a paramedic in the middle of my reception hall, while my husband knelt on a marble floor in his wedding suit, keeping a stranger alive. At 8:16 p.m., 40 minutes after the ambulance left, Elliot came back through the conservatory doors. He found me where he knew I would be, at the edge of the room, near the window, holding my bouquet in both hands like it was something to do with them. His mother had offered me champagne. David Park had sat beside me for a while without saying anything useful. The DJ had quietly transitioned to slower music, and a few guests were dancing in the soft light. Elliot's face was composed. It was always composed, but there was something underneath it now. Not guilt, exactly, but the expression of a man who has known for some time that a particular conversation is coming and has not yet decided how to begin it. Is he alive? I asked. He's alive, he said. I nodded. Good, I said. Then, why were they calling you doctor? He looked at me. A long look. The kind where the other person is not deciding whether to tell you the truth. They have already decided. They are only deciding how to deliver it. Because I am one, he said. The room continued around us. Someone laughed near the bar. The string quartet had resumed playing softly in the corner. I'm a trauma surgeon, he said. I've been the chief of trauma surgery at Jefferson Medical for the last 3 years. I absorbed this. And before that, I said, attending. Before that, surgical fellow, I did my residency at Penn, medical school at Hopkins. I leaned against the wall because my legs decided they did not want to do this standing up. You let me believe you were security, I said. I worked in operations when I was a resident, he said. Night shifts, yes, that part was true. I didn't lie about it. Not telling me isn't not lying, I said. No, he said. You're right, it isn't. I looked at him. This man I had just married in front of 34 empty chairs and a full right side and a string quartet playing Pachelbel. And I asked the only question that mattered. Why? He was quiet for a moment. Not evasive quiet, thinking quiet. The kind of silence he gave things that deserved real answers instead of fast ones. Because when I met you, he said, you talked to me like I was a person, not a title, not a credential, not a future asset or a reflected status. You asked me if I was hungry and you meant it. And it had been a very long time since someone meant a simple thing simply. He exhaled. I didn't want to lose that. I looked at the empty chairs across the room. My parents would have loved you, I said, for completely wrong reasons. I know, he said. They would have wanted you at every dinner. My mother would have told every person she knew. My father would have forgiven every reservation he had. I paused. And none of it would have been about you. I know that too. I'm angry, I said. You should be. I stopped. Also what? He said. I looked at him for a long time. I also still chose right, I said. Even when I didn't know everything. Even when there were 50 questions I didn't ask. I still chose right. Something shifted in his face. Something that had been held tight for a long time. Yeah, he said quietly. You did. We went home that night with more truth between us than either of us quite knew how to hold. We were not resolved. We were not finished. We were two people at the beginning of a longer and more honest conversation, and we both knew it, and neither of us ran from it. That was new for me. Not running. I woke up to my phone going to war. 6:47 a.m. The screen was white with notifications, stacked and multiplying, moving faster than I could read them. Missed calls from numbers I didn't recognize. Text from Lauren, text from David Park, a text from Melissa the coordinator that read only, call me when you're up. It's spreading. A video had been posted at 11:09 the previous night. 16 seconds, vertical. Shaky in the way that footage filmed by someone in a state of shock is always shaky, not deliberately filmed, just instinctively raised. It captured the exact moment Elliot dropped to his knees beside Richard Calloway. The audio was partial and unclear except for one thing, the voices calling him doctor, several of them overlapping, unmistakable. The caption read, the groom at my friend's wedding just saved my dad's life. Everyone kept calling him doctor. Who is this man? Posted by Richard Calloway's daughter Emma to her personal account. By the time I saw it, it had been shared 40,000 times. By noon, it had been shared 400,000 times. Elliot stood at the kitchen counter reading his own phone with an expression I had only seen on him once before, a controlled stillness that was not calm, exactly, but the thing that holds when calm is not available. This is going to get bigger before it stops, he said. How much bigger? He set his phone face down on the counter. I need to call the hospital's communications office, he said. By mid-afternoon, Jefferson Medical had released a statement confirming his role, his tenure, and his record. A hospital spokesperson named Diane Kowalski, 15 years in healthcare communications, and she sounded like every one of them, had apparently been fielding calls since early morning. The statement was precise and measured and described Elliot as one of the most distinguished trauma surgeons in the region, and said nothing it didn't have to say, which Elliot had specifically requested, according to David Park, who called me at 1 p.m. to check in. The internet did not stay measured. Within hours, there were threads, long, detailed, sourced threads, cataloging his career, former patients sharing stories. A nurse named Priya, who had trained under him, writing a 12-paragraph post about what it was like to work beside him during a mass casualty event 4 years ago, when a highway pileup had brought 16 patients through their trauma bay in under 2 hours, and Elliot had not left the floor for 11 hours straight. Former residents describing him as the best I ever had, and relentlessly demanding and utterly worth it. A medical journal article from 2019, in which he and 2 colleagues described a revised emergency triage protocol that had since been adopted by 17 hospital networks. I read all of it at the kitchen table while eating cereal I had poured and then forgot. I feel like I married someone I haven't met yet, I said. Elliot sat down across from me. You met me, he said. Everything else is just context. Context matters, I said. It does, he agreed. I'm still angry, I know. But I also need you to understand. I stopped. Tried again. I'm not angry because you're a surgeon. I'm angry because you made a decision about what I could handle, and you made it for me, and that's not. I shook my head. That's not something I can just put down immediately. I know, he said again. And then, I was wrong to do it alone. That sentence did more work than anything else he could have said. My mother called at 2:30. I did not answer. My father called at 3:15. I did not answer. My brother Jason texted, Claire, I had no idea. Please call me. I'm so sorry. I stared at his message for a long time. The thing about Jason Jason's message. The thing that made it harder to dismiss than my parents' calls was that it was probably true. Jason was 26 and spent most of his emotional energy following our parents' lead because it was easier than developing his own compass. He probably hadn't known. He probably genuinely regretted it. Probably. I put my phone down. What was happening was this. The video had done what my wedding could not. It had made my family's choice public. Someone had thought to screenshot my mother's original email declining the invitation, sent to a mutual family contact 5 months prior, and it had leaked into the same current carrying the video, and now the internet had the full picture. The woman who had called to tell me do not embarrass this family had herself become the embarrassment. Her professional network, a world of academic conferences and charitable boards and carefully maintained social appearances, was watching the same clips everyone else was watching, and making its own adjustments accordingly. I did not feel the satisfaction I thought I might feel. I felt tired, deeply, fundamentally tired. The kind of tired that does not come from one night without sleep, but from years of something. We left the city 2 days later. A colleague of Elliot's, Dr. James Okafor, a vascular surgeon who had apparently known about the whole situation for some time and felt strongly enough about it to offer his cabin without being asked, had a place in the mountains 4 hours north. We drove up in near silence, and when we arrived and I stepped out of the car into cold air that smelled like pine resin and wet earth, something in my chest loosened that I had not realized had been held that tight. For 3 days, we cooked simple things and walked along a trail that went nowhere interesting, and sat in front of a wood stove while the world continued without us. I slept 10 hours the first night, 9 the second, which my body had apparently been planning for some time. On the third day, by the fire, I asked him one more thing. Why didn't you trust me with it? He held his coffee mug in both hands and looked at the fire for a while. I trusted you with everything I knew how to give, he said. I didn't trust the world that came with the title. I've watched people change when they find out, not the people themselves exactly. The dynamic changes. The thing becomes about the title instead of about us. He paused. I'd had that before. I didn't want it with you. That's not your call to make alone, I said. No, he said, it's not. And if I'd found out a different way, not at our wedding, not on our wedding night, would you have told me eventually? He was quiet for a long moment. Yes, he said. When I was sure, he said. When I was sure it wouldn't change what you saw when you looked at me. I thought about that. I would have been angry then too, I said. I know, but probably less, I said. Probably less, he agreed. We stayed 3 more days. We came home. My father had a cardiac event 6 weeks after the wedding. My mother called me on a Tuesday morning, and her voice was stripped of everything she usually used to protect herself. The precision, the distance, the architecture of someone who had spent 60 years constructing herself as a particular kind of person. What was left underneath sounded very small. They're taking him to the hospital, she said. Please come. We were in the car within 7 minutes. At Jefferson Medical, my mother sat in the same kind of hard green waiting room chairs I had sat in 14 months before, and she looked smaller than I had ever seen her. Not physically, but in the way people become smaller when something large enough removes the performance. She held her purse in her lap with both hands, which was something I had never seen her do. Elliot went directly through the staff doors. I sat with my mother. We did not talk about the wedding. We did not talk about the voicemail or the letter or the invitations or the video. We sat in a place that had, for both of us, become associated with the beginning of something real, and we were quiet, and the silence was honest in a way that our conversations rarely had been. A surgeon I did not recognize came out at 11:20 and said that my father had been stabilized, that the team had responded quickly, that someone had already been involved in the early intervention phase who had made a significant difference in the outcome. Dr. Hayes asked me to come out with the update, she said. He'll be in when he can. My mother closed her eyes. Elliot appeared in the waiting room at 12:45 p.m. He had changed out of his suit jacket and was in scrubs, and he looked tired the way he looked after long nights, functional, contained, slightly outside his own body. He sat down across from my mother. He's stable, he said. We'll know more in the next few hours, but the indicators are good. My mother looked at him. She had spent 8 months looking at him as a category, a label, an insufficient option. She had written a 4-page letter about him and left a voicemail about him and organized 68 people to demonstrate her position on him, and now he was sitting across from her in a hospital waiting room, telling her that her husband of 39 years was alive. Thank you, she said. Her voice was different, smaller, and more real. We did our jobs, Elliot said. He did not perform generosity. He did not perform forgiveness. He stated a fact and let it be what it was, and I watched my mother absorb the understanding, slowly, visibly, that she had badly misjudged something fundamental, and that the misjudgment had cost her a great deal. My father was discharged 12 days later. The apologies came over the weeks that followed, in forms I had not expected. My mother wrote me a letter, not 4 pages, 1 page, handwritten, without defensiveness or qualification. She said she had seen Elliot as a category and treated me the same way, and she said she understood the damage that causes, and she was not asking for an immediate response. I read it twice and put it in a drawer, not the same drawer as my father's letter, a different one. My father's conversation, when it came, was quieter and heavier, and required no performance from either of us. I was conditional, he said. I packaged it as concern, but it was conditional. Yes, I said. That's not something I can take back. No, I said. It isn't. He looked at his hands. I would have been wrong either way, he said. If he'd been exactly what I assumed, I would would have been wrong to judge him for it. And as it turned out, he stopped. As it turned out, you were wrong anyway, I said. Yes. We sat together in a silence that was not comfortable but was at least honest, which was more than we had managed in years. I met my mother for coffee 3 months after the wedding. I had rehearsed nothing. I had decided nothing except that I was going to be honest, which was perhaps the thing I was worst at with her. She apologized again, in person, looking at me directly, without the letter's careful distance. And then she said the thing I had not expected and would not forget. I saw him as a category, but I treated you the same way. You were always just a reflection to me, a piece of the image I was constructing. I'm sorry for that. That started long before Elliot. I looked at her for a long time. No pretending this is normal, I said finally. No rewriting what happened. No letting it disappear into politeness. And no disrespect toward him. Not ever. Not in any form. She agreed without argument. With my brother Jason, I was gentler, because his culpability was smaller, and his regret was real. I told him he had a chance to be someone who showed up, and that I hoped he took it. He did, in the unspectacular, consistent way that matters more than any single gesture. He called. He was honest when he was wrong. He asked about Elliot without agenda. It wasn't healed, it was beginning. A year after the wedding, Elliot took me back to Jefferson Medical. He didn't announce it. He just drove there, parked in the staff lot, and walked me through the main entrance to the same waiting room where a man in a security uniform had brought me a cold sandwich at 2:17 in the morning, when I was frightened and hungry, and had no idea I was meeting someone I would love. We sat in the same green chairs. He had brought bad coffee and paper cups from the staff room on purpose, and handed me one without a word. You looked like you needed it, he said. Exactly what he had said then. I laughed. An actual laugh, uncalculated, from somewhere real. We sat there for a while. The room moved around us. A woman reading a magazine, a teenager asleep across 3 chairs, a man at the desk filling out paperwork with the slow focus of someone buying time against bad news. The ordinary suspended drama of a place where things happen to people. I almost left, I said, when I found out. I know. I was in our bathroom the morning after the wedding, and I sat on the edge of the tub, and I thought about it for a real amount of time. He nodded. He had known this. I had told him eventually, in the cabin, in the way you tell someone something when you finally trust that they won't flinch. What kept you? He said. I thought about it. You, I said. Not the surgeon. Not the chief of anything. You, the person who came back with a cold sandwich because someone looked like they needed it. That person was real. That person was always real. And I chose that person before I knew anything else. I turned the coffee cup in my hands. I decided to trust what I chose. He was quiet for a moment. I've been trying to be worthy of that, he said. I know, I said. I can tell. People ask me sometimes, now that the story has circulated, now that it has been screenshot and reshared and turned into something public, whether I forgave my family. I tell them the truth. I don't think forgiveness is the right word for what I did. Forgiveness implies a restoration to a previous state, and I have no interest in the previous state. What I did was decide what kind of relationship I was willing to have going forward, with each person, on terms I set rather than inherited. With my mother, cautious, boundaried, and occasionally real. With my father, limited contact, honest when we do speak, no pretending. With Jason, something that might actually become friendship, given enough time and consistency. With Elliot, everything, imperfect, ongoing, built from honesty rather than from performance. The 34 empty chairs were real. The voicemail was real. The letter, the silence, the deliberate absence, all of it was real. And it remains real. And I have stopped trying to make it into something softer than it was. But so is this. The man who brought me a cold sandwich at 2:17 in the morning is my husband. He saved a stranger's life on our wedding night and then came back and told me the truth. We built something out of actual material, the kind that holds. I didn't need my family to see that. They saw it anyway. And that, in the end, was never really about them. As I boarded my flight, my ex-husband was at a jewelry store with his mistress, telling her, "Buy whatever you want. My wife's inheritance is ours now." He didn't know that as he swiped the card, the clerk would say. The morning I destroyed my husband's life, I had a medium black coffee, no sugar, and I wore the same white cashmere sweater I'd worn to my father's funeral. I remember that detail because Mark had made a face at the sweater that morning, that specific micro expression of distaste he had spent 10 years perfecting, and said, "Don't you think it's a bit much? Wearing grief like an accessory?" I said nothing. I folded my boarding pass in half and tucked it into the front pocket of my carry-on. Gate B7, JFK to London Heathrow, one way. At that exact moment, 40 blocks south of where I was standing, Mark Reynolds was waving a manicured hand at a glass display case on the ground floor of the Tiffany & Coder flagship store on 5th Avenue, telling a woman named Tiffany Vance, yes, her actual name, the universe has a brutal sense of irony, "Buy whatever you want, babe. My wife's inheritance is finally ours." He placed a heavy matte black metal card on the velvet tray. He had never looked more confident in his life. He had exactly 10 minutes left before that confidence became the most expensive feeling he'd ever allowed himself. To understand the precision of what happened in that store, you have to understand the decade that made it necessary. I was Sarah Miller before I became Sarah Reynolds, and I was a completely different person. I had a studio in Williamsburg covered floor to ceiling in oil paint. I had a fellowship at the Pratt Institute and opinions about Basquiat and strong coffee, and the way afternoon light moved through factory windows. I was, objectively, someone with a shape and a direction, and a self that belonged entirely entirely to her. Then I met Mark at an alumni gala, and he was spectacular in the way that certain men are spectacular, the kind of spectacular that is less a quality and more a weapon. He was Greenwich, Connecticut made human, tall, immaculate, with a laugh that claimed entire rooms and eyes that were always calculating. He told me he loved my creative fire. He said he'd never met anyone like me. He said he wanted to build something real. What he actually meant was, I want access to the trust fund behind the creative fire. My father, Robert Miller, a self-made technology entrepreneur who had grown a small semiconductor firm into a $2 billion enterprise through sheer obstinate intelligence, saw through Mark immediately. He was always polite at dinners. He asked pointed questions about Mark's finances and listened to the answers arrive full of jargon and elegant evasion. And he smiled in the way a surgeon smiles when they already know what the scan shows. He never forbade the marriage. He simply said, once, quietly, standing at his kitchen counter over a glass of 20-year-old scotch, "Sarah, when someone tells you who they are in the first 5 minutes, believe them." I was 29 and certain I knew better. I married Mark 18 months later. Over the next 10 years, I watched my identity compress slowly into the shape Mark required of it. I stopped painting. I started attending charity luncheons and country club galas and managing a social calendar for a household funded entirely by my family's money. Though Mark accepted compliments on our 15,000 square foot Greenwich estate with the pride of a man who had built it with his own hands. His real estate firm ran on my capital, my family name, and my father's network of carefully cultivated introductions. In Greenwich, image is its own currency, and Mark was a masterful counterfeiter. There were no screaming matches, no dramatic ultimatums or flying plates. There was something quieter and worse, a long, slow compression of my selfhood into a shape that fit better beside him. When I mentioned returning to painting, Mark would smile and say, "Of course, sweetheart." Once things settled down at the firm, things never settled. When I brought up starting a family, he said, "Absolutely, when the market stabilizes." The market never did. Every conversation about my life ended in a polite redirection back toward his. I had spent a decade being managed. Then my father got sick, and 11 weeks later, my father died. 3 weeks after the funeral, Mark stood in our marble kitchen and told me my grief was getting exhausting. I want to stay in that moment, because it was the moment everything inside me that had been softly deteriorating finally calcified into something hard and cold and load-bearing. I was holding my father's old Patek Philippe, a scratched, worn thing he'd worn every single day since 1987, its crystal face clouded at the edge. The leather strap, replaced so many times the holes had multiplied. It had arrived from the estate lawyers in a small box with a handwritten note. 6 words, "Keep building, love, Dad." I didn't understand what he meant yet. Mark didn't look up from his phone. He was checking commodity prices, or real estate listings, or messages from someone. I wouldn't learn exactly which until later that night. He adjusted his tie in the dark reflection of the oven glass and said, as if repeating a reasonable business position, "The lawyers are waiting for your signature on the transfer documents. Stop being so emotional and start being a partner." I looked at him for a long moment. I wiped my face. I nodded. I did not sleep that night. Around 2 in the morning, I went to his home office to use the printer. Mark's laptop was open on the desk, screen glowing. He had always been carelessly arrogant with his devices around me, one of many symptoms of the fundamental contempt beneath our marriage. He genuinely did not believe I was paying attention. A single folder sat at the center of his desktop. He had titled it, with staggering confidence, simply, "Exit Strategy." My hands were steady as I clicked it open. My chest was not. Inside was a 63-page document, legal frameworks, financial timelines, annotated with the names of attorneys and financial advisors I didn't recognize. It outlined, step by step, exactly how Mark planned to have me sign my father's $50 million inheritance into a joint family trust, then immediately file for divorce before I could access independent legal counsel. Because the funds would sit in a shared account, they'd be subject to equitable distribution under Connecticut divorce law. He had a projected settlement figure for what I'd walk away with, $400,000, on a $50 million inheritance. My pulse didn't race, my hands didn't shake. I felt for the first time in 10 years, a clean, terrifying clarity, the kind that arrives when you finally see the shape of something you had been living inside of without recognizing its walls. I closed the laptop, I returned to the guest bedroom, and I dialed a number I knew by heart. "Elias," I said, my voice stripped of everything soft. Elias Thorne picked up on the second ring. He is 71 years old, silver-haired, built like an industrial freezer, and he had been my father's estate attorney for 34 years. He has a voice like gravel in a cement mixer, and a legal mind that could quietly dismantle a Fortune 500 company over a long lunch. He had despised Mark Reynolds with a consistent, professional thoroughness he had never bothered to conceal from anyone. "Sarah, my dear," he said, not startled, not even remotely surprised. "It's time," I told him. "I need to trigger the contingency clause. I want to leave him with nothing, Elias. I mean that precisely." A brief silence, then the sound of a man experiencing something very close to satisfaction. "Your father had this clause drafted 3 years ago," Elias said. "I've been waiting. I'll have the decoy documents ready by Sunday morning. You'll need to find the iPad." I already knew about the iPad. I'd seen it sitting in his desk drawer for months. The next morning, while Mark was at one of his breakfast strategy meetings, a fiction I would later have documented, I found the device, powered it on, and discovered he'd forgotten to unsync it from his iCloud account. The messages between him and Tiffany Vance went back 8 months. I will not reproduce most of them, because there is a particular quality to seeing yourself discussed as an obstacle, not as a person, not even as a complication, just as a logistical problem with a pending solution date. She called me the sad one. She asked, repeatedly and without patience, when the money was coming. Mark told her soon, babe, with the confidence of a man who had already spent it in his mind. The message that sealed everything was dated 6 days earlier. Once she signs Monday, I'm filing Tuesday. She won't have a dime left for a lawyer. We'll have the ring by next weekend. I photographed every screen. I emailed the images to a secure server Elias had set up for exactly this purpose. I returned the iPad to the drawer at the precise angle I'd found it. Then I went to the kitchen and made a full breakfast, because I hadn't properly eaten in 3 weeks, and I had a great deal of work ahead of me. Elias Thorne had 3 decades of my father's legal architecture stored in his memory, and he had, apparently, a talent for producing documents of such precisely legitimate appearance that a man blinded by greed would not think to have them independently verified. Over the next 48 hours, while Mark attended his various cover story appointments, Gerald Park, a former 17-year FBI financial crimes investigator whom Elias retained as a private investigator, confirmed they were exactly that. Elias and his team prepared 2 complete sets of transfer documents. The first set was what Mark expected: papers moving my father's estate into a joint family trust bearing both our names. These were the documents Mark would slide across the desk to me with that particular smile he reserved for closings. The second set was what I actually signed: a binding transfer into an ironclad offshore trust in Zurich, structured under Swiss private banking law, completely insulated from all marital assets and inaccessible to Mark Reynolds under any legal framework in any jurisdiction we were likely to touch. Elias had had this framework prepared and waiting for 3 years on my father's explicit instruction. My father had seen this coming long before I had. He had simply been waiting for me to see it too. The only performance required of me was the performance. On Sunday evening, Mark walked into the study smelling of Tiffany's jasmine perfume, which he had apparently decided was no longer worth hiding, and dropped a stack of documents on the desk with the particular theatrical flair of a man who believed he was moments from winning. He placed a heavy Mont Blanc pen on top. He looked at me with a warmth so practiced it had become almost real and said, "Sign the papers, Sarah. Let's secure our future." I looked at him across the desk. I picked up the pen. There is a very specific kind of calm that comes from looking your executioner in the eye and handing him a gun loaded with blanks. My hand trembled slightly as I reached for the papers, which Mark observed with visible satisfaction, interpreting it as the nerves of a woman overwhelmed. What it actually was the physical cost of 10 years of compressed anger locating the precise moment of its release. I signed every page, slowly, deliberately. Mark watched with the barely contained energy of a man who has just been told he's won the lottery and is waiting for the check to clear. What he had actually signed himself up for, by believing me, was the most expensive exercise in confirmation bias of his life. His arrogance was the mechanism. He had wanted me to be financially illiterate and emotionally compromised, so that is what he saw, because that is what he needed to see. He never verified a single document with an independent attorney. He never called the bank to confirm the transfer structure. He believed because believing was profitable. The moment Mark left the study, exhaling with the audible relief of a man who considers the hard part over, I sat alone for exactly 4 minutes. Then I went upstairs and began the quiet work of packing 3 suitcases. For the next 5 days, Mark's hubris swelled to a scale that would have been almost impressive to observe from a distance. Certain the $50 million would hit their joint accounts by Friday, he took out substantial bridge loans against his own real estate firm. Gerald Park documented the transactions as they occurred, funding non-refundable deposits on a penthouse in Tribeca, private jet charters, custom bespoke suits, and a trip to a jeweler in Midtown to preview rings. He was, with extravagant precision, digging his own grave with a gold-plated shovel. The peak of his delusion came at the Greenwich Country Club's annual spring gala, 4 days before my flight. Mark stood in the center of the room with a glass of Macallan in one hand and his other hand resting a few inches too low on Tiffany Vance's back, in full view of everyone who had ever attended one of our dinner parties, and smiled across our table. "To new beginnings," he said, voice booming with the unearned authority of a man who has already mentally moved into someone else's apartment. "My wife has finally seen the light. We're expanding the Reynolds portfolio in a major way. Massive things are coming." Several of the women in the room exchanged glances, the specific glances that happen when something true is visible to everyone in the room except the person it concerns most. The Greenwich Code of Silence held as it always does. "Yes," I said from 3 feet away, my voice quiet enough to require the room to settle to hear it. "Bigger than you can possibly imagine, Mark. I've made sure everything is exactly where it belongs." He grinned and patted my shoulder like I was a golden retriever that had performed a trick on command. I smiled back. It was the sharpest thing I owned. The night before my flight, I lay in the guest bedroom listening to him sleep down the hall, his confidence so complete it allowed him to sleep deeply and without apparent conscience. Everything was in place. Gerald Park was positioned, the accounts were primed, the attorneys were on standby. Elias had filed the emergency motion with a Connecticut state court judge, the Honorable Patricia O.C. Mensa, 22 years on the bench, who had reviewed the exit strategy document, the photographed messages, evidence, and the evidence of financial coercion, and had signed the restraining order at 9:30 the previous evening. At 6 a.m., I carried 3 suitcases to a black car idling in the driveway. Before I left the master suite for the last time, I placed 2 items on the center of Mark's perfectly made side of the bed. The first was an empty velvet Tiffany & Co. jewelry box. The second was a sleek black folder that looked exactly like a bank confirmation document. Inside it was a certified copy of the restraining order, the divorce filing, and a 1-page letter I had written myself, 3 sentences long, which I will not reproduce here. He would read it around noon. He would read it alone. By 9:45 a.m., I was seated in the first-class lounge at JFK, watching the tarmac through the floor-to-ceiling windows, my heart keeping a specific, anticipatory rhythm against my ribs. Gerald Park's updates arrived by encrypted message every few minutes. 9:50 a.m. Subject and companion entered Tiffany & Co. flagship 5th Avenue. Subject is being characteristically loud. I ordered a second coffee. 9:56 a.m. Subject is at the main display counter. Companion has selected a yellow diamond ring. Estimate value $340,000. 9:58 a.m. Subject has produced the card, requesting transaction. I watched the digital clock on my phone. 60 seconds, 30, 10. At exactly 10 shower a.m., I sent a single 1-word text to Elias Thorne. Execute. In the next 60 seconds, a financial guillotine dropped across every account bearing both our names. Elias's team at Whitmore, Thorne & Associates moved with a precision that 34 years of preparation tends to produce. Every joint account was permanently closed. All secondary credit cards attached to my name were instantly revoked and flagged. A court-mandated freeze locked Mark entirely out of the Greenwich estate. The locks had been changed at 8 hours a.m. Gerald Park had confirmed they were changed correctly. On 5th Avenue, Mark Reynolds leaned against the polished glass counter with the physical confidence of a man who has never in his life experienced a declined transaction. He pointed at the yellow diamond ring with the casual authority of someone ordering from a menu they've already memorized. "We'll take that one," he said. He picked up the black card and slid it across the velvet tray with a small theatrical flourish. Tiffany pressed herself against his arm and made the sound of a woman who believed her future had just been purchased. The sales associate, a poised, 26-year veteran of that store named Dennis Huang, whom Gerald Park had quietly briefed 40 minutes earlier, picked up the card and ran it through the terminal. A red light, a sharp, hollow beep. Dennis frowned with careful, professional neutrality and tried again. Another beep. "I'm sorry, Mr. Reynolds," Dennis said. "The transaction has been declined." Mark laughed. It was the laugh of a man who cannot yet access the correct interpretation of events. "Try it again, buddy. I moved $50 million this morning. The system is probably catching up." Dennis typed something into his screen. He looked at the monitor for a long moment. The polite retail expression he had maintained professionally for 26 years did not slip so much as it was simply replaced with something cooler and more absolute. "Sir," Dennis said, his voice lowered to the precise register that ensures nearby people lean in while the intended recipient feels acutely exposed. "I'm receiving a high-priority system alert on this account. It was closed by the primary account holder approximately 10 minutes ago." He paused. "There is also a fraud flag on your name from the issuing bank." Another pause. "I've been instructed to retain this card." Dennis Huang picked up the black card. He placed it in a lockbox beneath the counter, and the lockbox made a small, definitive click. The silence that followed lasted perhaps 3 seconds. Then, Mark Reynolds began to shout. He demanded the manager. He demanded his bank. He cycled through the name-dropping that had worked in rooms like this for his entire adult life. He went red in the face in the specific way of a man whose access to power has just been revoked and who cannot yet believe the revocation is permanent. Store security. 2 large men in dark suits who had also been quietly briefed began moving toward the counter from opposite sides of the room. Tiffany Vance backed away from him. She looked at the empty velvet tray. She looked at the 2 security guards. She looked at Mark, red-faced and shouting, the elegant performance of his life finally abandoning him entirely. She took out her phone and called a cab. At gate B7, my flight was called for boarding. I handed my passport to the attendant, walked down the jet bridge, and settled into my seat by the window. The plane pushed back from the gate, the engines built to a steady roar. I watched the geometry of the airport recede. I took out my phone to switch it to airplane mode. Before I did, one final notification lit the screen. An encrypted message from Elias Thorne. Wire transfer of $50,000 to Zurich Trust, successful. Have a good flight, Ms. Miller. I turned the phone off. I watched the ground fall away, and for the first time in 10 years, I breathed air that tasted like it was entirely mine. Gravity is a specific kind of punishment for people who built their lives in the air. When Mark finally left 5th Avenue, without the ring, and shortly without Tiffany, who kissed him once on the cheek in the cab line and then gave the driver an address on the opposite side of the city, he ordered his driver back to Greenwich. He needed the papers. He needed to fix this. He needed to find the seam in the plan and pull it open. His town car pulled up to the wrought iron gates of the estate at 11:40 a.m. His key code produced a red light on the panel. He climbed out. The pedestrian gate lock had been replaced. And there, arranged in a neat row on the cobblestones of the driveway, were 6 heavy-duty black garbage bags. Inside them, his custom suits, his golf clubs, his collection of luxury watches, his bespoke shoes, his Mont Blanc pen set. Taped to the outermost bag was a certified copy of of Judge Osei Mensah's restraining order, signed and stamped, alongside the divorce filing. He was locked out, the accounts were closed, and because of the bridge loans he had cheerfully taken out against his own firm during the previous 5 days, loans he had been certain he would repay the moment $50 million arrived in his accounts, he was nearly $2 million in personal debt, secured against a business that had no liquid assets remaining. The moment Tiffany Vance processed the full picture, no money, no estate, no Tribeca penthouse, and a man whose firm was now drowning in bridge loan debt, her number was disconnected within 48 hours. She moved to a different brokerage firm. She did not return his calls, his emails, or the one handwritten letter Gerald Park documented him dropping at her building. She proved, with admirable efficiency, that she had never been in love with Mark Reynolds. She had been in love with Mark Reynolds' access to my father's money, and that access had lasted approximately as long as the card swipe. Elias Thorne dismantled Mark's legal counterclaims in Connecticut family court over the following 3 months, with the systematic, unhurried pleasure of a man who has been waiting decades for exactly this moment. The exit strategy document was entered as Exhibit A. The photographed messages were Exhibit B. The bridge loan documentation, obtained via court order and showing that Mark had leveraged his own firm against funds he had not yet legally received, was Exhibit C. Judge Osei Mensah heard the full case and ruled accordingly. The divorce decree was signed. Mark was held solely responsible for all personal debts he had incurred during the marriage's final weeks. His counterclaim for a share of the estate was dismissed with prejudice. He appealed. Elias Thorne answered the appeal with a 40-page brief that apparently caused Mark's own attorney to recommend he not pursue the matter further. He did not pursue the matter further. I did not return to Greenwich. I did not watch the fallout in person. When my flight landed at Heathrow, I took a cab not to a 5-star hotel booked under my family name, but to a small, light-filled studio apartment in Chelsea, a property I had purchased in my own name, with my own savings 7 months earlier, when I had begun to understand on some level that this day was coming. I unpacked my 3 suitcases. I bought a cheap coffee maker. I slept for 14 hours. The studio was small enough that the oil paints I'd shipped ahead of time took up an entire corner of the main room, which meant the first thing I saw when I woke up was paint. It felt like finding a part of myself I'd mailed to a safe address before the fire started. I began painting again slowly, the way you begin using an injured limb, carefully, then with increasing confidence, then with a fury I hadn't known I was storing. The work was dark at first, dense, consuming shapes, but there was always a line of light somewhere in the composition, and I didn't plan it. It simply appeared, the way honest things do when you finally stop managing them. 6 months after I left, the last confirmed sighting of Mark Reynolds that Gerald Park provided came through a mutual acquaintance visiting New York. She spotted him from a cab window in New Jersey, working as a leasing agent for a strip mall developer. The bespoke suits were gone, an off-the-rack jacket. The chest-out posture he had maintained for 15 years had been completely hollowed out, replaced by the vacant, slightly stunned expression of a man who has discovered, too late, that he was never actually playing the game he thought he was playing. I did not feel satisfaction when I read this. I felt something quieter, relief maybe, closure of a kind that doesn't require witnessing. 1 year after I boarded that flight, the air in London tasted like rain and possibility. I was a working artist. My first solo show at a gallery in Shoreditch had sold out in the opening week. British Vogue had photographed me in front of a large canvas, dense, bruised shapes with a single streak of fierce light cutting through, for a feature on women artists in the second chapter of their careers. The painting was titled The Parasite's Shadow. It had sold for £100,000 before the magazine hit newsstands. I stood on the wrought iron balcony of my studio one evening, looking out over the Thames, holding my father's Patek Philippe. It was ticking steadily against my palm. The water was dark and gold in the last light of the day, and I stood there for a long time, letting myself feel the particular weight of 10 years compressed into 3 suitcases and then released. A substantial portion of the inheritance had gone into a foundation, a thing I had not planned in advance so much as recognized as inevitable. It provided aggressive legal and financial support for women attempting to exit relationships defined by financial coercion. It was staffed by attorneys and financial advisors and advocates who understood that the most effective kind of trap is the one that looks, from the outside, like a life. My father wouldn't have simply wanted me to be rich. He was a man who built things. He would have wanted me to build armor for other people. I had done that. I was doing that. One evening, my assistant, a sharp, relentlessly capable graduate student from the Royal College of Art named Priya, who managed the foundation's administration with a precision that made Elias Thorne compliment her, which was not something Elias did, looked up from her laptop with an expression I didn't immediately recognize. "Sarah," she said carefully, "I need to show you something. We just received a wire transfer to the foundation." "How much?" I asked, wiping charcoal from my thumb. $10 million, Priya said. "It's entirely anonymous, but there's a note attached to the reference." She turned the screen toward me. The note was 6 words. "Your father would be proud. Keep building." I stood very still for a long moment. Priya was watching me, waiting, uncertain of what she was seeing on my face. The watch was ticking in my hand. The Thames moved dark and gold below the balcony. Somewhere in the city, paint was drying on a canvas that had been empty 10 years ago, and a foundation was open, and a door that had been closed was now a door that opened from both sides. I looked at the screen. I looked at those 6 words, and for the first time in as long long as I could remember, I cried without any particular effort to stop. My father, the original architect of my independence, had left one last room in the building. He had simply been waiting for me to find the door.